Okay, good afternoon. So today I want to outline for you Cabinet decisions on the reduced New Zealand contribution to stability in Afghanistan beyond the withdrawal of the Provincial Reconstruction Team from the Bamyan province. The PRT is on schedule for withdrawal by the end of April after a decade assisting the people there as part of a wider aim of contributing towards security and stability in Afghanistan. Despite our withdrawal in April, the NATO ISAF mission is not scheduled to end until December 2014. The government believes it remains in New Zealand's best interest to make an ongoing contribution on a reduced scale to ISAF and Afghanistan beyond the PRT. This is because we do not want to see the gains that have been made over the last decade in security, development, health and human rights lost. To that end, a small niche contribution, proportionate with our resources and in line with the scale of partner country contributions, has been decided on by Cabinet. This contribution will operate from the withdrawal of the PRT at the end of April for 1 year until the period at the end of April 2014. In total, it will involve 27 NZDF personnel in behind-the-wire niche roles based mainly in the capital, Kabul. The group will comprise of the following. Firstly, 8 NZDF personnel deployed to the UK-led Afghan National Army Officer Training Academy in Kabul. As announced last year, this particular deployment is likely to extend beyond 2014. 12 NZDF personnel to the ISAF Special Operations Forces headquarters employed mainly in intelligence and planning roles, including 3 New Zealand SAS personnel, 3 NZDF personnel with the ISAF headquarters in Kabul, and 3 NZDF support personnel as part of the New Zealand National Support Element. And finally, 1 NZDF officer with the UN assistance mission to Afghanistan. So separately, the PRT Theatre Extraction Team that is helping get the PRT equipment out of Afghanistan has had its mandate extended to the end of June, by which time it's expected to have completed its job. While the deployment of the 27 NZDF personnel is for a year, Afghanistan is a changeable and unpredictable environment. To that end, Cabinet has agreed that the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defence will review the deployment later this year. Despite the fact that our decade-long deployment in Bamyan is coming to an end, it's important that we continue to play our part in international efforts to improve the security and prosperity of Afghanistan. At the same time as we talk about the future, it's important that we dwell for a moment on what we've achieved during the decade that we've been in Afghanistan. New Zealand has stood side by side with our ISAF partners in Afghanistan since December 2001. We've deployed trainers, special forces, planners and staff officers across the country in support of the ISAF mission to first stabilise and then build up the capacity of the Afghan National Security Forces. We now leave Bamyan as one of the safest and most secure provinces in the country, with local forces trained to sustain the gains New Zealand has sacrificed so much to achieve. The livelihoods of the people of Bamyan have indeed improved. In the last 10 years, Bamyan Hospital has been rebuilt and new health centres have been built in 7 districts. Mortality rates for children under 5 have almost halved. Bamyan University now has 2,700 students, of whom 15% are female. New school buildings and classrooms have been built across the province and programs implemented to ensure school textbooks are provided and teachers receive training. We provide substantial agricultural support, modern farming techniques have been introduced, and better water management and flood protection measures have significantly improved agricultural yields and farm emissions. In the next 12 months, the largest solar power system built in Afghanistan will come online, with around 2,500 homes, businesses and government buildings to receive a reliable electricity supply. New Zealand remains committed to working with the Afghan government and our ISAF partners to ensure that Afghanistan becomes a more prosperous nation and is never again used as a haven for planning acts of international terrorism. Earlier today, you were aware that Education Minister Hekia Parata announced interim decisions for 31 of the 38 schools in the Greater Christchurch area affected by the government's proposal announced late last year. Having listened to feedback from parents and school communities during the consultation process, she has decided not to proceed with about a third of the proposals. This means of the 31 schools, 12 remain open, 7 will close and 12 will merge into 6 schools. The schools will now have until March 28th to provide any further feedback before final decisions are made. These have been difficult decisions, and it will be difficult for the families attached to those schools proceeding to close, but parents and children will remain supported through the process. I want to reiterate that the government is absolutely committed to standing beside the people of Canterbury and rebuilding Christchurch. That's why we're investing $1 billion into education in the greater Christchurch, including building or rebuilding 15 schools. This will ensure Greater Christchurch is one of the best schooling networks in the country that will serve communities for many years to come. On another matter, Justice Minister Judith Collins has today announced that legislation will be introduced, clearing the way for changes to laws dictating the royal succession to the throne. The Royal Succession Bill allows an elder daughter to precede a younger son in the line of succession, meaning that the order of succession to the throne will no longer be based on gender. The new laws will apply to any children in the royal line of succession born after the 28th of October 2011. The new rules will also allow a person married to a Roman Catholic to become king or queen. Currently, prospective heirs who are married to Catholics are disqualified from succession. The changes will not allow a Catholic to accede to the throne. These rules will require the sovereign to swear an oath to maintain the Protestant religion, and that they will remain unchanged. The bill also removes the requirement that members of the royal family must seek the sovereign's permission to marry, and instead require just the first 6 in line to the throne to seek consent to marry. All 16 countries sharing the Queen as head of state, including New Zealand, must have the same laws of succession. In the UK, a bill to make these changes to royal succession laws is currently going through Parliament. New Zealand also needs to make changes to our laws because changes to UK laws do not automatically apply here. And finally, just in terms of ministerial activity, tomorrow I have caucus and question time as usual, and on Wednesday. I'm in Wellington on Thursday, and I'm in Rotorua on Friday, and I'm in Christchurch for various events, including the 2nd anniversary of Christchurch earthquake on Friday. Just in terms of the House this week, the House is the House this week. It's the government's intention to progress the Privacy Information Sharing Bill, the International Finance Agreements Amendment Bill, and the Environment Canterbury Amendment Bill. Wednesday is, of course, a Members' Day. Questions?
Why keep those 3 SAS troops on in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so those 3 form part of the planning and logistics team, planning and intelligence team that have been there for quite some time. I'm not really in a position to go through in detail all of the operations that have taken place as a result of the work that they have done, but I think it's fair to say they've been very effective. So what's now effectively happening is that group is transitioning to, instead of having a focus only on the sort of Bamiyan province and the interests that relate directly to the New Zealand contribution there, to be a wider ISAF-led team. So in other words, they'll be doing the same kind of work, but based on the wider Afghan issues.
And is there a chance they could stay on beyond that year as well?
Well, I think, as I said in my remarks, it's a changeable place, so we'll always review these things, but the intention at the moment is that this is a 1-year sort of commitment of 27 personnel. At the end of that year, of course, the government will look at what both other countries are doing and how we feel about matters, and then reassess that.
The 27 you're saying are mainly inside the wire, that indicates some are going to be outside?
No, they're all inside the wire. So they do a variety of things. I mean, the 8 personnel who are training, they're behind the wire. We actually announced that, Jonathan Coleman announced that in Chicago. The 12 are part of this sort of logistics and planning team. The reason that's a bit bigger is that they've previously been supported by people who've been part of the PRT, but because of course the PRT is not there anymore, they need a more standalone sort of group. Then there's 3 staff officers who are basically in head office in Kabul, and one that's in the UN Assistance Mission, and then the other 3 NZDF personnel working back in sort of different sort of roles. So they're all behind the wire.
It's quite a big number given the sort of continued sort of 150 most of the time anyway.
Yeah, I suppose what you'd say is, from what we can see, every country that's been engaged in Afghanistan in terms of ISAF NATO members are making some sort of contribution. We had a sense of what we wanted to contribute and areas where we felt comfortable, and that fits in the submission that we put forward in the offer of assistance we've Like, another way of looking at it is we've had up to 180 people, and I guess we're on our way now to 27. But I think that the main point I would really make is that, look, we have invested a huge amount of resources, and we've lost 10 very brave men there and women in the course of the last decade. And it's really important that we just don't walk away from Afghanistan and leave it isolated. If we want to see the job done in Afghanistan to be able to get back on its feet and be, self-governing and hopefully safe society, then we need to provide ongoing support, and that's really what we're doing to sort of honour what we've done over the last decade.
But
Isn't
wasn't
it a
a
bit
bit
disingenuous though to say that we're withdrawing when so many are staying on?
Well, you've got to remember every country has a different contribution in a different place, so I can't speak for other countries, but in the case of our PRT, we were right up the top of the list in terms of transitioning, and that was at the request of both ISAF and in fact actually the Afghan government who believed, and rightfully so, that Bamiyan is one of the safest places to transition and wanted us to do that. Obviously our SAEs have been there for a period of time and rolled them over, but they've gone home anyway. So I think everyone's a bit different. I mean, the United States and the UK, for instance, have very large contributions and are more spread out across Afghanistan and have a bit more of an ongoing role. So I think it makes sense in terms of both what we've done and the transition that we're now making.
Are we
Wasn't
really
that long?
withdrawing though, or are we just extending for a smaller amount of people and therefore just keeping going and reducing those numbers rather than withdrawing?
No, I think I would certainly say we're withdrawing. I mean, we will continue to have people in Bamiyan because we'll have them in different roles. There won't be badged NZDF people, but we have ongoing humanitarian assistance aid that we supply there. So there's a change in the faces, if you like, and the sorts of things we're doing, but essentially that's different. So this is quite a different sort of role really to what we have been doing. We've historically essentially had New Zealand forces, and while the PRT's primary role has been to sort of build up that area and provide support, they've nevertheless been on the front line, if you like. Really no one in this group is on the front line.
So how many humanitarian aid people do you have still in Bali?
We'll have some, I don't have the exact number for you, but we're committed to a couple of major projects there, one in health and one in, I think, in agriculture. But Murray McCully's office can give you the exact number.
Given the
Given
DCs.
the deaths of military personnel there, which have been that long ago, are you satisfied about the safety for non-military personnel working up there?
Well, as best we can, yes, and obviously people need to think that through carefully in terms of who's there and how long they're there and the particular roles that they play. I think a lot of it's driven out of New Zealand, but from time to time they teach people on the ground.
What about
Is it-
insider attacks? Because the number of them have been increasing and we've so far remained unscathed.
Sure, I mean, so that is always a risk, but I think it's worth remembering that with the exception of the 8, which are as part of that kind of Sandhurst and Sand, the officer training school, all the others are really not probably the place where you're likely to get that anyway. They're either in head office or whatever it might be. They're in ISAF headquarters, so unlikely there. And even with the 8, that's of course a risk, but it's been a risk that's been there for a very long period of time. It hasn't changed because we've been doing this for a while. It's not a new initiative.
And given that those SAE soldiers went back to protect the troops in Bamiyan, why keep them on after the troops in Bamiyan?
Primarily because they've been very, very successful in providing that intelligence and planning role. So essentially what they do is package up the information that is used to then go and execute a mission. So they provide a lot of the framework for which the legal support is then based off, how to actually undertake the operation, the intelligence around that operation. So they are an enabler without being the actual people who are knocking on doors or carrying weapons. And that's been hugely successful. As I said, I can't sort of detail everything we've done and I'm not in a position to do so, but I can say that it's been definitely in New Zealand's interest, and they've done a very, very good job. So much so that ISAF want them to consider providing effectively the same services across Afghanistan so that they can provide the same sort of support.
And it wasn't that long ago that you were announcing an early withdrawal. Why not stick with the original September mandate?
Well, essentially we're sticking to that. We are withdrawing. This is a legacy contingent for a period of time, as I said, to back up, I think, a decade of work and to honour those 10 men and women. And I think it's a realisation that everybody who's been involved in the NATO ISAF contribution is likely to have some personnel in Afghanistan for a period of time beyond their formal withdrawal. So it's a question of how many and what they do, and we've been in a position where we've been able to indicate both where we think we can add value and also what it is we actually want to do. I think it's probably better for New Zealand to be in that position than to be asked and end up having to maybe supply roles that we're not so keen on.
Just
Yeah,
so
you
I'm
said
so
the
clear,
government-
Prime Minister, the New Zealanders who are staying on in a humanitarian role in Bamiyan, they have Defence Force personnel who are included in that 27?
No, they're not part of that 27.
So
Murray McCully's office will have those
So there's a
details.
separate New Zealand
A
Defence
separate New
Force.
Zealand. I'm pretty sure there's some people there. I'll have to check it, but I'm pretty sure.
But are Defence Force personnel?
I don't think so. I think they come from NGOs.
You've told us several times that your government is committed to withdrawing from Afghanistan at the beginning of this year. Have you broken that promise?
Oh, not in the slightest. We're withdrawing from the PRT. We're actually withdrawing arguably a year and a bit earlier than people had originally thought, because I think originally we were saying the end of 2014. That's because it makes sense for all of the partners, and we're having an ongoing role, but that's a very different role from the role that we've previously played. It's not on the ground in terms of the PRT, and it's not in terms of support services.
So what does withdrawing mean?
Well, withdrawing from Bamiyan means that we don't have 140 odd people, a little less these days,
You said
in the
Afghanistan
PRT.
last year.
Yeah, but I mean, the point here is that we've had to assess or want to assess what we now want to make as our next contribution. It's a very different one. I think people working in head office or providing some logistics and planning is quite a different setup to what we previously had.
Who asked for this sort of different role, or did you suggest that?
Look, these sorts of things are discussed at length, so I can't tell you exactly where everything emanates from, but it's been pretty clear that all NATO ISAF countries are engaged in considering what a future Afghanistan looks like and how the gains that have been achieved over the last decade can be locked in, and it's part of that process. I mean, the Minister of Defence is going to Brussels tonight, I think, for yet another one of these meetings. They're ongoing.
Those 27 people, are they all in Afghanistan at the moment?
I can't tell you where they all are. Some are, but not all of them are, I don't think.
And are they all military as opposed to civilian?
They're NZDF personnel. NZDF.
In terms of Christchurch schools, the 19 schools announcements were made around today. Some of those schools were originally given a timeline of 2015. Why has the timeline been dramatically moved forward?
Well, I think the first important thing to note is that obviously there's now a consultation period that will be undertaken with the Minister and the schools up to, I think, the 28th of March. We'll wait for their submissions. That will then give us an opportunity to go and engage in further dialogue with those schools. Some of it was around, from memory, that it made more sense to actually bring that forward and give certainty while we're building other schools. So it's really around the complexity about whether it's logical to keep the school open. And the concern was that if we had a far date for closing, but it was obvious that the decision had been made, that there would be significant reduction in the role and it would be harder to support the school.
At a public meeting, the Minister said to intermediate schools specifically that they would be able to see Year 7 students right through to the end of that 2-year period of intermediate schooling. Now they're in a situation where parents have enrolled children and now they're likely to have to leave. And what's the government's kind of view around that?
Well, all of that can be part of the submission that that school makes and that they need to put in place by the 28th of March. I'm sure in fullness of time the Minister will consider the merits of that argument.
Can we just ask you about the royal succession? What part did New Zealand play in drafting that new law?
Well, in terms of the New Zealand law, obviously we drafted their own law, but New Zealand's been quite active as a participant in this whole process. So it was important that I think that the UK knew that there would be support in the realm countries, and so New Zealand was seen as a good sort of honest voice in this process. And so our Cabinet Office, which is where these issues have dealt with, played quite a forward-leaning role in working with other countries. And I think all you're seeing is a modernisation of succession laws that make an awful lot of sense. I mean, New Zealand's a country that believes in gender equality. It shouldn't really matter whether it's male or female that's firstborn. They should be able to be the next in line for the throne. Again, the rules around marrying a Catholic to us seem very logical.
Now, what sort of difference does it really make in relation to the Catholic partner if they would be prevented from bringing up their children as Catholics because a Catholic couldn't be the head of the Church of England? So really is it just a bit of a token measure?
Well, at its most basic point, it's not a token measure because, of course, without that rule change, a Yetta the Throne couldn't marry a Catholic and become the next king or queen. So it's absolute and quite binary in that nature, and that's a significant change. But yes, I mean that individual does end up still having to be effectively, part of the Church of England, and clearly the children have to be brought up under the Church of England. So it's a change to the current rules, not in totality but in part. But without the change, it would fundamentally, limit options, and so it's pretty significant for that individual.
They couldn't really be a true practicing Catholic in that sense, could they? Because they had to renounce the pledge to raise their child as a Catholic.
No, but then it's a compromise position, I think you have to accept, and that's not perfect, and there'll be some that would believe that's wrong, but it's certainly a better situation than we're currently in. It's there are plenty of people that get married where one side is Protestant and one side is Catholic. My wife's parents were in exactly the same position.
Did Cabinet discuss plain packaging today and what was the outcome?
Yes, it talked about plain packaging, and we'll probably be in a position to announce what our next steps are within the next day or two.
On the school closures, there's a lot of debate and a lot of criticism from opposition parties directed at your government over this. Is it unreasonable criticism?
Well, I think we have to take a step back and say, why are we here? And the reality is, while there's always an ongoing review that the Ministry undertakes about the nature of schools and the likes, and whether we have too many that are in the right place, the Christchurch earthquake dramatically changed that discussion and forced upon the government a much broader discussion. That was always going to be difficult because it was happening at a time where contemporaries were going through an awful lot of either personal grief or anxiety or just trauma because of what's been happening in their city. I think we've done the best job that we can do to balance what the community would want. In other words, I think the ministers genuinely listened to that feedback. A third of all of the schools either slated for closure or merger are now staying open. There will be a lot of heartache for those schools that are either merging and closing, and I fully understand that. But equally, I just sort of simply say sometimes the government needs to address these issues for the long-term good of those communities. And there are reasons either around the demographics of where people are living, the quality of the land that the schools were built on, or the buildings themselves that necessitate these changes.
Are you confident that you've got the information you need to make these decisions? For example, you've got the census later results later this year. If you've waited, would that have given you better information?
Look, again, the Ministry, I think, has done its best to model that information, the best information it's got. Yes, of course, the census will give New Zealand a better sense of its absolute numbers, but I think they've had the capacity to drill down in a fairly detailed way what's happening in these isolated communities. I mean, we are fairly aware of what the likely population, for instance, will be in the red zone. We have a pretty good sense of what's happening in terms of specific buildings and the like. So some of these decisions are driven off demographics, but they're quite easy to understand. Some are driven off the damage to schools, and some are an opportunity to build something that might be better for the kids in the future. And I think in a way that's the challenge that we're going through here. We're really trying to balance both the current situation that we find ourselves in with a desire to make sure we deliver for the next generation of contemporaries. And my sense is we've got that about right. It'll be very painful for those children that don't want to leave the particular school they're in, but my experience is they adapt very quickly to the new school they're going to, and a lot of new schools will be built in Christchurch, and those facilities will be, I think, welcomed by Canterbury kids for a long period of time.
What do you say to the layman, though, who looks at that and says, well, why didn't the government just wait for the census and they've got the best possible information, etc.?
Because I think we're in a position to have a pretty good understanding of what that population is likely to look like. When, for instance, we know that the red zone, where those houses have been bought by the government, is not going to be inhabited, at least for a very long period of time. We have a pretty decent sense of where the growth is taking place out in Rolleston and other parts. So, yeah, I mean, my sense is that we've got it fairly right, and you've got to remember that part of this is also done on future modelling of the likely population of these areas, and all of that comes off a degree of subjectivity, which a census won't help you anyway, because it's all future modelling of how many people are likely to move into a certain area, how much land is available for development, etc., etc.
Julia Gillard announced new procurement policies yesterday to help those people in Australian industries deal with the high Australian dollar.
Yep.
Should New Zealand do something similar?
Look, I haven't seen exactly what she's done around procurement, although we've been doing a lot as a government around procurement, as I'm sure you're aware. Again, it's been saving the government an awful lot of money. I mean, I've seen what she's been doing in relation to their jobs plan, and all I'd say to you is, I'm not knocking the initiatives, but many of them are either initiatives that New Zealand's already got in place, or in total they are about $1 billion over a reasonable period of time, like quite a number of years. And this is a $1.3 trillion economy, and it's coming from being financed through savings from other expenditure or other tax breaks they were previously giving companies in terms of R&D. So it's really a recycling of money in the system.
Do you think though that New Zealand government department should be buying New Zealand products rather than the cheapest or wherever it comes from?
Well, we have certain rules that mean that we can't discriminate, because I think that's against our FTA. So we have to observe that. We can't just simply buy a New Zealand-based product because it's a New Zealand-based product. But I think what's fair to say is, the New Zealand, those who purchase things on behalf of the government look pretty closely about where products coming from, what it might mean, the capacity to service it, whatever those issues are. So again, it's a balancing act, but I think they get it fairly right.
So her procurement policy,
Sorry, you go.
so her procurement policy goes broader than the government's own. So it's not requiring people to necessarily buy Australian, but at least ensure that those companies know that a contract is being let, so they have an opportunity to bid on it. Do you think there's any option to do more here?
I haven't had any detailed advice on what she's doing there. The best person to take that up would be with both Bill English and Jerry Brown, because they've been running that process. All I can tell you is, in terms of the procurement that we've been undertaking as a government and the changes we've made, we've been very successful in negotiating much better prices for the government, buying things often across the whole of the state sector, and using the strength of the overall government to negotiate a better deal. There's other things we can do. We can always have a look at it.
Sky City's report due out tomorrow, the AG's
Convention
report.
Centre, is it? Okay, yeah.
If that is to clear you, will you push the button on that project?
Yeah, well, so obviously the next step would be whether Sky City still serious about wanting to continue that process, and I don't have an update on that. But obviously we've seen it as a very important thing for New Zealand and for Auckland. We think the International Convention Centre brings a lot of tourists in at off-peak times. I think the economics stack up very well. Government continues to be reasonably cash-strapped, so we think the sort of deal we were negotiating makes sense. But obviously the final details of a deal and whether that's acceptable to the government is something we'd have to negotiate. But in short, all things being equal, we'd like to get on with it as soon as we can.
Have those negotiations been going on while the Auditor General has been doing this investigation?
I don't think there's been a huge amount of detailed negotiations. The view has been to wait until the report came out. I can't say that there hasn't been correspondence between MB and Sky City. There may have been, but I haven't been seeing ongoing reports on the matter.
And you confident that it will be cleared?
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen the
amazed.
report?
Yeah,
Have you seen-
I've read it.
So that's why you can have confidence that you'll be clear, that the government will be clear.
Well, in my view, there's no political element to it. So on a basic question, there's no political element.
Have
So
you
as
seen-
far as you're aware, the deal will be able to go ahead with the convention centre.
Well, let's wait and see till you read the report tomorrow.
You've seen a draft,
yes,
Christmas about Prime Minister, and said you weren't losing sleep over it. Have you seen any subsequent drafts since
Yep.
then?
Losing even less sleep.
The Auditor General's office was adamant today that nobody would have got an advance copy.
Well, I've seen the draft. I haven't seen the final. We'd be amazed if the final's changed much.
Honestly, Prime Minister, how much of a practical impediment to the MRP sale is the delay in the Supreme Court stuff?
It's not really. I mean, in the perfect world, we would have had an answer today because that fitted our timetable best. But I think that a couple of weeks is not going to. It pushes us up to the edge, but it doesn't make the first float on the timetable that we wanted impossible. And frankly, look, we could have tried to push the process and pass the order in council today, but given the the Supreme Court is working as fast as it can on a relatively tight deadline anyway. It would have been a bit churlish, I think, for us to push that.
Are you concerned that investors, mums and dads, won't really know the outlook for the electricity industry unless they know whether Rio Tinto is going to continue producing?
Well, I think it's important to understand with Rio Tinto, I mean, they have a 3-year contract with Meridian. So whatever happens for the next 3 years, there will be effectively no change there. Secondly, I think it's worth remembering that the power that supplies New Zealand aluminium smelter at Kamelco essentially comes largely from Manapōuri. And while it's possible with an upgrade to the grid to get that electricity into the main grid, it requires a reasonable capital upgrade from Transpower. So again, even if that if there was something bad to happen to the smelter, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a lot of power in the main grid in day one. So look, let's see. The government continues to monitor what Meridian are doing with Rio. Hopefully there'll be a successful conclusion to the negotiations.
Have you had any recent reports on the health of Solid Energy at the moment and in terms of its position?
Have I seen
Any recent reports on how it's...
Yep, over the course of the last couple of weeks I will have seen a number of reports in relation to Solid Energy.
And is it in any position to be sold?
I think it would be very, very unlikely it would be a candidate for mixed ownership in the very short term.
Would you look at the market
Sorry, we're
conditions
going to have to
for
wrap this up.
selling these power companies now, given the really soft demand in the electricity market, which is having all kinds of effects in terms of investment in the market?
Well, I mean, all I can tell you is that there's generally, and unless there's some break in the historical pattern, all the graphs I've ever seen over sort of time has been that there's a pretty direct correlation between the use of power that an economy consumes and economic growth. So as your economy grows, you tend to use more power. I'm pretty confident that New Zealand will continue to grow, hopefully at a faster clip than it has over the last 3 or 4 years. And so, if you're asking me whether there's going to be increasing demand for electricity, I would assume that likely would be.
Is this the best time to get the best price for the taxpayer for these assets?
Well, I haven't seen any advice that would indicate to me there's a particular reason why we shouldn't go to market. What is the best price and the best time is always something that's a matter of subjectivity. But the New Zealand NZX is trading at, last time I looked, a high. These have been good times for investors in New Zealand shares, and I would have thought there's plenty of cash sloshing around in the system with very low yields in the bank. So, and then they can't offer you advice about whether it's a good idea to invest in those companies, assuming you get the go-ahead from the Supreme Court. But I haven't seen anything that would indicate to me that we shouldn't take those companies to market.
The G20 at the weekend said they were concerned about currency wars. Are you worried that currency wars could cost jobs in New Zealand?
Let me take this and I'll go. It's quite clear that some countries have been either beneficiaries of or actively looking to devalue their currency. Part of the process of printing money has, in the case of some countries, been a mechanism used to try and seek a devaluation. As we've said in the past, very little New Zealand can do about that. But I think it makes sense myself for the G20 ministers to affirm that everybody embarking on a program and trying to devalue their currency doesn't make sense. And I think the only other point I'd simply make is that while there is impact on exporters, and that is unquestionably correct for exporters, particularly in US dollars, New Zealand consumers are much wealthier as a result of a high exchange rate. New Zealand consumers are paying less for virtually all imported goods as a result of the high exchange rate. The Reserve Bank has a lot less pressure on the system because there is very low levels of imported inflation. A lot of New Zealand businesses are importing equipment that's now being paid for at much lower prices. New Zealand is much more competitive as a place because of a higher exchange rate. So we weren't fabulously successful as a country when we were at 40 cents, US cents in the dollar. So yes, there's some pressure there. Obviously, the government has said on numerous occasions that a slightly lower New Zealand US exchange rate would be beneficial. But I think we should be sort of a bit careful what we wish for.